Welcome to Southwest Manuscripters / Surfwriters from Southern California. We have a very exciting, eclectic meeting today, a lineup of 4 authors who have published with Atmosphere Press. So I'm going to head off right to the first one, which is Wanda Maureen Miller, whom I know as Mo, and I'm very grateful to say is also a member of Southwest Manuscripters. And Mo and I share some history in Arkansas. We've both lived in Arkansas, so her memoir is something I read and really could relate to. It's beautifully written, very, very talented. She grew up on an Arkansas farm, got educated, moved to California, taught college in English. She's published 6 books, a historical novel, The French, 3 textbooks, Reading Faster and Understanding, 5 editions of Reading Faster and Understanding More, a slightly fictionalized memoir, Last Trip Home, and now book number 1, Madeleine, Last French Casquette Bride in New Orleans. Retired, she plays pickleball and is writing book 2 of Madeleine. So welcome, Madeleine. I'm Mo. Oh my gosh, you become your own character. Anyway, welcome, Mo, and take it off. And then what's happening is you will pass it on to the other authors, and then I'll come in at the end when you want me to. So take it off. Take off.
Thank you, Jerry. And you could call me Madeleine. I've had so many names, it doesn't matter. So my new book, Madeleine, as you mentioned, and by the way, I'm too old and untechnical to get one of those fake screens in the background that has the book on it. So I just have to hold it up the old-fashioned way. So my new book is both similar and different from my mem novel, Last Trip Home. The settings of these 2 books are different. New Orleans in the 18th century and Arkansas in the 1940s and 50s. The main characters are similar in that Madeleine was a poor peasant girl who copied her aristocratic employer, and I, or my character Grace May Ree, was a poor redneck girl who got an education and faked being a city girl who was accustomed to indoor toilets. Madeleine and I were different in that she was beautiful and virtuous, and I was never, ever either one. In this new book, I try to sprinkle in a few French words here and there that I can't pronounce properly, like s'il vous plaît and merci beaucoup. Whereas in Last Trip Home, I use redneck dialect that I can pronounce properly, as in, I can still talk Arkansas if I want to. I had to change how I talk. You can't get hard as no college English professor if you talk like this. So I had to change it. And now reading from chapter 1 in Madeleine, which starts in France, 1728. Madeleine Boucher knew her life was about to change forever. The strikingly lovely 17-year-old sat for the first and last time with her mistress, Countess Louise de Mandeville, in the richly appointed de Mandeville carriage parked dockside at Port de Lorient. She saw a group of young women and nuns waiting on the dock to board Les Belles Soeurs, a large sailing vessel. The 59 other filles à la casquette were picked to be wives of French settlers in the Louisiana colony and were accompanied by Ursuline nuns. The girls kept nearby their casquettes or trunks filled with dowries supplied by the French government. Most were poor, respectable girls from good families and had traveled by public conveyance. So they kept staring at the impressive carriage and wondered aloud about its 2 occupants. Madeleine heard a tall nun with a faint mustache try to quiet them. Please, mes enfants, you have been picked by the church and King Louis XV to exert a stable influence on our colony. You will soon be wives of the leading French settlers. Act accordingly, s'il vous plaît. Madeleine knew she would be one of those wives and was frozen with fear at the prospect of being married to a stranger in a strange land. She looked at the ship that would take her from the familiarity of her past life to a new world. She had no idea what to expect. None of the girls knew whom they would marry. The Countess finally spoke. Girl, it is not too late to change your mind and return to your parents' farm. No, madame, I will not go back. There is nothing for me on that farm. Her thoughts raged. She would never return to that hovel to once again become a serf like her parents, beaten down and groveling in the dirt for their overlords. She would never again be a servant to anybody or let a man dominate her as her father did, her quiet, passive mother. I hope you understand why I must send you away. It is for your own good. This time, Madeleine looked away without answering. They both knew why Madeleine was being sent away, and it had nothing to do with her best interests. Finally, a seaman shouted, "All aboard!" and the Casquette girls and nuns swayed up the gangway to the ship. Michael O'Brien, the red-haired Irish clerk, checked off the women as they climbed aboard the huge merchantman sailing vessel. A tall, commanding man in a braided coat, obviously the captain, stood behind him. Madeleine tried not to look at the captain. Michael's eyes widened as Madeleine took her turn, but he tried to remain businesslike. "And your name, mademoiselle?" "Madeleine Boucher of the de Mandeville Chateau." She could not resist stressing the de Mandeville name. She knew she would be the only servant in the group, so she might as well be associated with one of the noblest houses in France. The clerk was so distracted by her beauty and poise that he did not hear all her words and repeated, "Madeleine Boucher de Mandeville," mistaking her last name. Madeleine drew in her breath. She saw the handsome captain's eyes flicker, but she remained silent. She nodded and moved on, her heart pounding at her deception. Should she correct the error? But who would know besides the captain? Would he tell or even care? With one stroke of the quill, she was elevated from servant to nobility. She set her chin and thought, "This is a new start. By all that is holy, I can appear to be a lady as well as anyone." She thought of the Countess's reaction if she knew of her deception, and her ordinarily composed face lit up with a smile, further dazzling the clerk and the captain. And now I'm telling or talking, not reading. Though the captain and Madeleine are drawn to each other throughout the book, unfortunately, she marries an asshole, as I did in my first marriage, an abusive sweet talker who joined the Ku Klux Klan, perhaps to teach me a lesson for not being a racist. Madeleine married an aristocratic French lieutenant who was unfaithful and drank and gambled away his salary. Madeleine had to use her farm girl's skills to put his land grant under cultivation. She made a profit, planted magnolia trees, and called the land Magnolia Grove. This did not endear her to her husband, and their always one-sided sex life became worse. He had a child with their slave, Rima, who felt so bad for childless Madeleine and so guilty, she took her to a conjure woman in the woods who gave her a hallucinogenic drink, and they participated in a special naked ceremony around a waterfall. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read that scene. My favorite part has Madeleine wanting to burst a bubble on the nipple of a large black breast. Madeleine was so turned on that night, she had great sex for the first, but not the last time. Her daughter Solange was conceived that night. Solange was even more beautiful than her mother, but not as virtuous. She is the subject of book 2, almost finished and already accepted for publication. So that's the end of my part. And our next reader is another author from Atmosphere Press, from, as he said, Calgary, Alberta. He is going to interrogate me before he reads. So over to you, Aaron.
All right. Well, Mo, the first question I wanted to ask is about the genre. Why did you write a romance novel? What drew you to the genre? I'm imagining a personal affection for romance in general, and that you enjoy reading the genre. But what else about this form appealed to you specifically as a writer?
Well, it was during a period when I was in graduate school at the University of Arkansas. I was scared to death and reading things I'd never read before, like Shakespeare and poets like Keats and Shelley, and even occasionally teaching them as a graduate assistant. So for escape, which I badly needed, I started reading romance novels, and I read them constantly for, I don't know, 10 years maybe. And of course, as you said, what appealed to me was that they were about women, and they featured women, and usually they had a nice ending, so I could be happy at the end. And I started writing for a different reason. So I'll let you ask that question.
Yeah, well, I actually have an extra writerly question that I've added to the list of things, but I'll save that for the end. So also, again, as a writer, Madeleine is a work of historical fiction.
Yes.
And I personally, I hate doing research. I've had to do it in grad school, but what challenges did you face as a writer of historical fiction, and how did you go about it? What was your process? What was your approach?
Well, I have to confess something. I actually wrote this manuscript in the 1980s. I didn't choose to write it. I'm glad I wrote it. I was given $20,000 up front by a traditional publisher and assigned this particular subject. I had lived in New Orleans for a year, but I knew nothing about the history. I had a year to write 1,000 pages. And it took me probably 9 months to do the research. Then I had to write the 1,000 pages in 3 months. So this publisher went broke immediately after my book. I hope not because of my book. So the book never got the play it should have. So after writing all these other books and being 80 years old, I thought, well, maybe I'll get that manuscript out and give it another chance. So obviously they couldn't publish the whole 100,000 pages anyway. So I started this series, and I've forgotten all your question. Is that enough?
Yeah, and so the process of going about the research and including it, but I'm wondering also with historical fiction, I've read works of historical fiction where the author is a little too eager to display the fruits of their research. Your novel never, it sort of followed the Hippocratic Oath. It did, it did no harm. All of the historical details were nicely weaved into the narrative, and I never felt there was any unnecessary details.
Oh, thank
And
you so much.
yeah, so well, that worked all the better to transport us there. And then studying a book in Louisiana never hurts because just because of the culture, I guess, regardless of the era. Now, in your introduction, both to what you read, the first chapter, and also what you told us, we hear some parallels between you and your protagonist. How then, if you mention virtue and beauty don't figure into these parallels between the two of you, how do you see yourself like her?
Well, the obvious similarity is that we were both born on farms. We were poor, not poverty stricken, because if you're on a farm, you don't starve, you get food to eat. But we both had to claw our way up to, for me, it was lower middle class. And for her, it was up to aristocracy because she copied her employer. And then she had that luck of being mistaken on the ship for a de Mandeville. And we both, and this is a spoiler alert, but she ended up happy with the man she wanted. And I ended up living in sin, not a lot of sin anymore, but in sin with a retired doctor for 28 years. I call him the old dude. He's 3 months older than I am. Sometimes I call him Dr. Frugal because he's rather economical. So we're similar in that we had a happy ending.
Oh, good. That awesome. Now I'm fascinated by the point of view of this novel. And I will confess I am not well read in the romance genre, but you seem to use a third person omniscient, and I don't know if that's typically the point of view taken in romance novels. But why did you pick that point of view, and what was it like writing a work from this perspective? Because you're dipping into very different minds.
Yes, that is true. But I like that. The thing about omniscient narrator is that they are godlike, or he or she is godlike, to keep my pronouns correct. And I like being godlike. I like being able to enter any character's head and slip out into just simply objective narration. I think that it isn't just romances that are written with that point of view. A lot of romances, at least now, skip point of view, like there'll be a chapter in one character's point of view, another chapter in another.
Yeah.
But a lot of the classics, don't ask me which ones, I'm 80, but a lot of the classics too are written with omniscient point of view.
Well, Anna Karenina came right to mind, and I just hadn't seen it. I just hadn't seen many more recent books written in this point of view. So I was I'm impressed by that as well. Now, here's an extra question that I wanted to ask writer to writer. I spent the longest time and the most effort on my first chapter. Your first chapter introduces the characters and sets a scene with the historical context and adds the crucial detail with the mistake of her name. And so I'm wondering, did you spend the most time on the first chapter, or was it the hardest? Was there something unique about writing that compared to the other chapters?
Well, it's true. I wrote it, then I rewrote it, revised it. That's what you do, and I did want to get the elements you just mentioned. And also I wanted to introduce that handsome captain.
Sure.
So I did want all of those important elements and conflicts in that I would want to read myself. I wouldn't read a book just for the history. I would be bored now. I would have to be paid to do it. But I wanted the history there. And this is based on a true story in that there were poor French girls who were paid by the French government to come and settle down wild soldiers and settlers who were running off into the woods after Indian maidens, and the French government and the king wanted them to settle down. So first they sent over a bunch of whores, and that didn't work. So now they sent over paid these poor French girls to go. I wanted that all to be clear in the first chapter.
Well, I'll say this is a generous jewel of a novel, and yet I think there's a parallel between you and your doctor that I'm so happy you ended up with being, let's say, maybe not frugal, but economical. You pack so much into this first chapter, and you do it without any wasted words, and yet this novel emotionally, with this vast array of characters, with the historical context, with the descriptions, it's honestly it's a generous jewel of a novel.
Thank you, Aaron. And now it's time for us to go to you.
Yeah.
You, Aaron Francis Roe, teaches at Bow Valley College. He lives with his family in Calgary, Alberta, and he is going to interrogate me. And then he's going to read.
Are we going to conduct further interrogation of
I'm so sorry.
I'm game.
No, this is I'm so sorry. This is the time for your longer introduction and for you to read. I totally messed that up. So his book that he's about to read from is Saints and Martyrs. And it's a fascinating and unusual book about a young man's struggle, his impossible struggle to become a saint, so he can join his saintly, he thinks saintly, father. I'll turn that over to you now.
Absolutely. So the origin of this novel, I feel, is relevant and helpful for me to mention just to set the context, because this began as a memoir. I grew up in a devout Catholic home. The day after I graduated from private Catholic high school, I entered the seminary the day after, and spent a total of 6 years studying for the Catholic priesthood, but never made it to, obviously never made it to ordination. At a dinner party a few years after my seminary years, someone mentioned to me the paper chase, and how John J. Osborne, I believe is his name, wrote a book, who had attended Harvard Law School. He wrote a book of the insider's view of a world that very few people get to see, let alone live. And in the paper chase, which is a pretty good novel in my opinion, and then it led to a film, which some say is better, and then to a dismal TV series. But it was an opportunity to see a very intense world, the life of a Harvard Law student. And so I started out writing a memoir. Someone very wisely advised against that, and to, make it a work of fiction. And that's where I was able to shape the work and distance myself from it. So what I'd like to do is read. I forgot I've got this here. I'd like to read the first chapter, most of the first chapter, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the book as a whole. So here we go. This is Saints and Martyrs, chapter 1, Original Sin. Christ appeared dejected, which made Damien feel guilty. He was studying mathematics in his basement bedroom and struggling to ignore the erection that pressed painfully against his tight uniform pants when the mailbox outside clanked shut. He looked up from his textbook to the crucifix hanging above his desk. Maybe it's just my math module, Lord, he prayed. He caressed Christ's pierced feet and sincerely tried to hope that the schoolwork he'd mailed to the Alberta Homeschooling Center last month had returned, graded. But surely Christ and Damien's deceased father in heaven knew that deeply, secretly, he wanted the Bay's catalog to have arrived. Gazing down from above, they'd seen him fight lustful thoughts the past few weeks, and they knew as well as he did that the Bay delivered its spring edition in February. So, with today being the end of the month, trying to hide his desire was futile. He felt like Judas as he kissed the crucifix before rising from his desk. But his bedroom, like everywhere in Grandma Schiller's house, was so crowded that when he shoved back his chair, it hit the bed he shared with his 5-year-old brother James and crashed to the cement floor. Damn it, he said, then immediately held his breath, worried that his family upstairs had heard him curse. Already 6'3" tall at 17, his head nearly touched the basement's low, drooping ceiling. He raised himself onto his toes, pressed his ear against the molding, paper-thin ceiling panel, and listened carefully. Darwin was known to cheat at backgammon, his mother was telling James and his 2 sisters, Mary, 7, and Bernadette, 12, educating them in the same Bible stories, creation science, and warnings about socialism that he'd received at their age, which reveals his moral character and casts doubt on his theory. Her voice hadn't wavered, so he sighed, relieved, but didn't yet lower himself from the ceiling. In case one of his siblings had heard him curse and felt inclined to tattle, he said loudly, I mean, darn. There was momentary silence upstairs. They'd heard him that time. But his mother, unwilling to interrupt her teaching from 9 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. on weekdays, resumed. Fossils, despite what some experts claim. He could have recited the lesson verbatim. He lowered himself from the festering ceiling and wiped the mold from his ear. The slimy black dots smeared across his hand. How could something so disgusting figure into an intelligently designed world? Perhaps the smear was an omen, marking his hand that would likely soon lead him to sin. He could cut it off and pluck out his eyes, guarding himself from temptation. He could pray to his father for spiritual strength and try to hold out against lust for another day. Or he could run upstairs, tell his mother he was checking the mailbox for schoolwork, and then, whatever happened, confess to Father Dennis, his parish priest, tomorrow. His frustration in this cramped, molding house made some relief necessary. He cleaned his hand with a tissue, hoping that sin could be as easily removed from the soul, then picked up his chair, which miraculously wasn't broken, and hurried from the room before guilt held him back. As he crossed the crowded basement, dodging lawn furniture, graying stacks of the National Catholic Register, and towers of rain-wrinkled encyclopedias, his mother's voice traveled clearly through the ceiling. Pressing his ear against it had been needless, an anxious act. Now he knew the mold had been an omen, a harbinger of sin. His desire persisted, however, so he moved faster. The ancient stairs creaked under his 250 pounds. At the top, he threw open the door, forgetting his strength and his anxiety over his soul. his eagerness to reach the mailbox. The door crashed against the kitchen wall. "Damien!" his mother yelled from the living room. He stood in the doorway, crossing his hands in fig leaf position, trying to appear contrite, but also hiding his erection from his siblings, who sat in a neat row, making him feel guiltier yet with their wide, innocent eyes. Bernadette and Mary, hands clasped atop their desks, wore matching gray jumpers, long brown hair and pigtails, and starched white shirts with Peter Pan collars. James's hair, dark brown as his father's had been, was parted to the side and slicked down. He wore a white short-sleeved collared shirt, a navy tie, a red cardigan, and gray slacks that fit him well. Damien's version of the same clothes was tight and uncomfortable, particularly in his present state. His thin, pale mother wore her chestnut hair in a bun, and her starched blouse and gray skirt were so flat she matched the blackboard she stood before, chalk in hand. She'd mounted the blackboard on the wall 4 years ago, just after his father died. Damien had helped her hang it, doing what his father would have done, except he'd hung it slant. Since then, his always pious mother had heightened her fervor, no longer checked by his father's calming presence, and their family life became a flurry of mass, prayers, catechetical instruction, and readings from Butler's Lives of the Saints. They hadn't bothered to adjust it. The crooked blackboard, he often thought, seemed to belong in a house that had suffered an upheaval and had never been restored to order. He stepped forward, stopping at the edge of the kitchen, where the curled squares of smoke-stained linoleum gave way to the worn beige carpet that demarcated Grandma Schiller's living room, or as his mother had named it since moving her children into the house, the Academy of the Immaculate Conception. She said, "What have I told you about slamming doors?" "Not to," he replied, slightly sarcastic. He anticipated her next question by readying the answer he'd prepared downstairs. "Where are you going?" "The mail. My math module." "Why now?" "To review it for mistakes," he said. "To improve for..." He pointed up, implying God. He didn't want to take the Lord's name in vain because perfection in God's eyes, his family's constant goal, wasn't driving him to the mailbox that afternoon. And since he'd already cursed downstairs, possibly giving a bad example to his siblings through the basement ceiling, he didn't want to add blasphemy and lying to the sins he'd confess tomorrow. His mother, however, seemed to interpret his gesture differently, in a way that furthered her designs on him, which had been growing increasingly insistent of late. She said, "To prepare yourself for seminary." He suddenly grew angry. Why did she try to control him like this? While the priesthood attracted him with its commitments to prayer and celibacy, her pressure spoiled its appeal. But he wanted to avoid conflict right now, so he resigned himself to her manipulation, at least for the moment, and said, "Yeah, the seminary, probably." She furrowed her brow, showing she acknowledged the legitimacy of his quest. "Next time, wait till we're done." He nodded and hurried past his siblings. He opened the foyer door and then quietly shut it behind him, so his mother had no further grounds to criticize his disruption. Inside, stagnant clouds of Grandma Schiller's smoke filled the dark, cramped space, and the afternoon sun beat against the tightly tinfoiled windows so that, though it was frigid outside, the air within sweltered like hell. As he waited for his eyes to adjust, coughing and waving his hand before his face, Grandma Schiller mumbled prayers from across the foyer. "Hi, Grandma." "Damien," she said, her gentle German voice soothing after his mother's loud reprimands. Why was his mother so harsh compared to her mother? One day he'd ask Grandma Schiller. Saint Anthony, patron of lost things, help us find God's path to salvation. Her pious words and cigarette smoke hung in the air like incense. Though he could only see shadows now, he knew from crossing Grandma Schiller's space when the door was open or the light on, that the walls around her were covered with brightly colored holy cards, small rectangles of laminated paper with saints drawn on the front and intercessory prayers on the back. Grandma Schiller claimed to have memorized these prayers decades ago, and now the words faced the wall, leaving the drawings on display. He'd studied them so closely when he'd moved in, he could now picture them vividly. The images of long beards, flowing robes, knotty staffs, uplifted eyes, pale complexions, and thin floating halos haunted him because they reminded him of his father, whom he considered a saint as well. According to family lore, his father had died without having committed a mortal sin, and so they believed he was in heaven and could see them always, something Damien cherished, except for times like now, when his intentions were shameful. And that's all I'm going to read from the novel. Damien goes on to pursue sanctity at an eerie mountaintop seminary, and also to attempt to record his father's life in the tradition of the lives of the saints, to prove to himself and others that his goal of sanctity is not in vain, because his father is certainly in heaven waiting to reunite with him. So that's my presentation. Dave, I know you have some questions.
Well done, Aaron.
Awesome, thanks.
I do. Having gotten to know these four folks over the past few months has been really great, and you know, having to getting to know you a little bit better, Aaron, and now into your book. I have to admit I'm not fully done yet, but I am well on my way. Knowing that, and you know, us having talked a few times over the past several months and having seen the presentation, I'm always real curious about, okay, this started off as a memoir and then shifted to fiction.
Yeah.
Yet how much of that really shifted to fiction? Like, we're talking like, you know, 40, 60, 50, 50. And is it, in other words, like how much of it really went away, the memoir piece of it?
Okay, so I would say overall, I would say that the novel is 50-50, really, to be honest. The first few chapters, the very first chapter that I just read from is largely made up, and I know Mo and some others have interrogated me about the catalog memories and what that leads to. I'll let you people find out. Some of those, I'll admit, are autobiographical of my adolescence. But the first few chapters and all the way to the entrance to the seminary is autobiographical. Once we get to the seminary, that is when, halfway through, that's when it turns all fiction.
Great. You know, it's and I have a follow-up question about that. Another thing I've been thinking about a lot as I'm reading your book, memory being what it is, I'm curious, and in all honesty here, if there's points during your book where the fact v fiction, that crossover, where even in your own head it's a little blurry.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know there was recently, I saw on Bloomsbury, I saw an academic analysis of these kinds of novels, autobiographical, semi-autobiographical, mem novels, and the ethics of it. Because really, if I think back to like the big instance that comes to mind is James Frey with A Million Little Pieces.
Right.
And how he was claiming, this is a work of nonfiction, that what you'll find depicted essentially in these pages happened. And then, and then it was discovered that they did not, or they didn't to the extent, and he was, but in a way, with a novel like this that is so autobiographical, I'm claiming on the cover a novel, implying this is a work of fiction, and then some of the events are actually what things that happened.
Right.
And certainly a lot of the emotion is ringing true. And so there is like I believe there's a possible ethical concern really with these kinds of books. I mean, I changed names and it's in the third person. And like I said, the second half is completely fictional. But I'm essentially saying this is a work of fiction when that's not quite exactly 100%.
Well, I have to say, like even Kerouac said that the greatest fiction is nonfiction with all the names changed. So
yeah, right, yeah.
It's an old art.
Yeah.
It's an old scam.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it's interesting because again, like getting to know you and reading through the book, I see so many glimmers, just little points of Aaron throughout it. I'm like, really, this seems kind of memoirish, but it is. Again, the tricks of memory, where where the actual event and some sort of fictionalized version that maybe works a little bit better for you sets up in your head, like where that boundary exists becomes a little bit blurrier as you age. I'm fine.
And I was thinking, and this may lead to your next question, but I was thinking about, like, I have no idea what John J. Osborne experienced at Harvard Law School, but James Aggie's The Death in the Family comes to mind. Because in a big way, and in Canada we say Aggie. I've heard his name pronounced otherwise. A G, okay.
James a G.
A death in the family, and a father who dies drunk, like in a car
tragically.
accident.
Yeah. Tragically.
And I find that a G a fascinating person. And
Absolutely.
I mean, he was a movie critic, and the opening chapter is him and his dad going to a Charlie Chaplin movie. And the detail there, like, that's him. And the story as a whole, that's his life. And then, so that was a huge literary influence on me.
Right.
A death in the family.
Well, it's curious. And I mean, that was another question that I wanted to ask you was, again, like having had, several discussions and getting further into your book, knowing more about your background, the Catholic upbringing, the seminary, then, turning your back on it, kind of, coming back to it, floating in and out, like all of that going on in your head, like that. It's at points, you liberating yourself and yet feeling constricted by, guilt, tradition, loyalty to those who, brought you up in the faith, all of those things. Like for me, that's a real interesting and curious question I have about your set of influences. They do seem to run around both secular and religious figures, almost in equal doses. In fact, I was telling a friend of mine the other day, it's like, yeah, I can't tell if like his main influence for this book was St. Augustine or James Joyce. Like I'm having trouble like figuring that out. And so that said, I'm curious if you can go into that a little bit. In the context of Saints and Martyrs, is there, what were some of the more prescient influences as you were going through this? Well, all secular and religious, mixture of both.
I've got one professional review or two actually back, and the second one mentioned some at points a lack of subtlety. I've got St. Augustine and James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist actually in the book. There's Damien's doing a study of St. Augustine, and then he's got Joyce's book on his lap during like a boring general assembly at the seminary. So
it's funny. I've gotten to the St. Augustine part. I haven't gotten to the Joyce part yet.
Yeah, but certainly, like I would say it's equal parts. Another book that really influenced me at the point when I was going from memoir to fiction is A Confederacy of Dunces.
Right.
Just with the Ignatius D. Riley and Damien don't share a lot in common, but there's some similarities.
They're an anti-hero. I see that.
Yeah, there are some similarities. And so that was a big, John Kennedy Toole was a big influence. Sylvia Plath with the Bell Jar. And, at the point, the year or two after I'd left the seminary, I really turned quite emotionally, maybe even aggressively against the Catholic Church and writers like Christopher Hitchens and so on. In it just that spirit, that emotion.
Right, the agnostic, atheistic, like overload.
Yeah, sort of
right.
The anti-religion.
Right.
And then at the same time, as I've got in my list here, Hitchens, right above that, I've got hagiography, which is the academic term for the process of telling the lives of the saints,
right.
Butler's Lives of the Saints. So I've got Hitchens and then hagiography, and the
That's
way
running the gamut.
Well, yeah, I'm really trying to it is, isn't it? It is, isn't it? And so it was fascinating in that way to be dealing with really influences that were in conflict, but it's a story of internal conflict. I should mention one last influence. Karen Armstrong was a nun in the UK, and she left her after 9 years, left her convent, and then is now a writer and is didn't entirely leave the faith, but she had a book, Down the Spiral Staircase and Through the Convent Gates, and these were memoirs that she wrote about sort of a process of deconversion almost at the time. Anyway, leaving religious life. Those were another one I would like to mention.
Right. Great.
Cool. Was there anything else you wanted to ask?
That was pretty rich. You like kind of ran through all my questions. Like I had 3 or 4 of them, and you had several parts that kind of ran through them all.
Someone has a question in
continue.
the chat.
Yeah, I could continue, but maybe we can wait for the Q&A.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Now, so I'll leave it there. And I will turn now to you, Dave.
Great.
And I might go through a little more of an in-depth introduction here, because I have not yet even begun your book.
Right. I have to mention up front, folks, that I was kind of the last of the posse to get my many boxes of books. And yes, it is pretty awesome to receive many boxes of your own book.
Yeah.
And so I was late getting them out the door. Jerry, I think you were the first one to get it, but you're only a state away from me. So Calgary, Alberta. That's that's probably I'm hoping it's close. But so my friends with the Atmosphere Press posse here, flying a little bit blind, but they've heard me yammering on and on enough to, I think, get the gist.
Yes, and you're very good at describing the spirit of the book. But Dave Buckout here is a writer of short and long fiction, and on his website, he's got also, I think, some poetry you have even on there, right, Dave?
It's true. Yeah. I've kind of tried it all.
Fiction, creative nonfiction, history, and verse. There we go.
Yeah.
And he began writing in college, so mainly semi-automatic experiments that
what
eventually evolved into something someone could actually read. Like flash fiction? Was this what you were trying, or
kind of before flash fiction was a thing? I mean, it really was literal, like automatic psychedelic style rambling out of my head.
Nice.
And occasionally I would find little random nuggets of substance in there that I would try and work into something readable. And who knows if any of that was ever successful, but it did lead towards more serious fiction writing, in my late 20s. Yeah.
And you moved, and it seemed to be there's a real authenticity to this narrative of your development as a writer, because from these flash fiction before they were the term really became popular, you moved through short fiction, travelogues, essays, meditations, and then really pounded it out with the verse, with the poetry.
A lot of poetry.
A few scattered publications. I noticed on your website you have an unpublished novel, and then a published short story, and then another one that is you're still trying to find a publisher for. So you've got some of those completed works on your website.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of stuff up there. It's some of it is finished. Well, it's all finished. Some of it is has been published before. Some of it is unpublished, and maybe that's for the best. But in general, I feel like it's all a pretty good representation. Like I said, I've dabbled in kind of everything. Like I wasn't a writer in growing up. I wasn't even really a reader all that much. It's just when I hit college, I just was surrounded by it was just like the renaissance of my life. I just couldn't believe I'd been missing out on all this stuff my entire life. And my brain just kind of exploded, and I just took it all in. And so from that point forward, that was the first time I even conceived of like writing. That's a thing. I did not pay attention in English class growing up at all. So I was definitely behind the curve. So I just kind of floated through a bunch of different things without any real program, and finally really settled on a couple things, this novel being obviously the number one.
I was going to say, however fragmented or scattered your initial efforts were, we've now finally, and I say we because another author publishing through Atmosphere, we've wrapped up, Dave, a full-length novel, The Regular, and
Yes.
it's coming out a little later this month. You haven't released officially released yet.
That is true. April 22nd is the official release date. I've got kind of an initial print run, and I am actually taking orders for signed copies through my site. Very
Great.
do-it-yourself, very small scale, but DaveBuckout.com is, it's all there. Pre-order has started, but yeah, April 22nd, Earth Day, is going to be the official release, so I can't wait.
Yeah, can't wait. So last thing I'll say is that for over 2 decades, you've been running your own business in web development, website development, online development, and that you live in Atlanta, Georgia with your beautiful wife. And
Indeed.
I will now hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. Thanks to JD, Wanda, Aaron, Cami, Lenny, Nick, Kyle, everyone at Atmosphere. Been a really great ride, and really thanks to all of you for having us in. This is a really great treat. I feel like we kind of have this Atmosphere press posse now, and we're almost kind of like a little writer gang. It's great, and so it makes it a lot easier to come in and talk in group form, passing the baton between each other, and feel like it might hopefully be a little bit more entertaining too. But anyways, thanks Jerry and and JP and everyone for having us in. Really appreciate it. So again, my book is called The Regular. A new dawn breaks. The haze is fine mesh gauze. Steam loiters as it would about a geyser field. It is felt, implied, seen. Eyes open on this morning, a day staunch in its midsummer promise. August arising, Mercury aspiring, sucking mist through indolent filters of humidity. It hints at the broiler to come, the fight ahead. For it is here in this forgotten urban hood, once the grandest of them all, where the city reads a homegrown prodigy, a wandering guru hunkered down in the haze. To one Marvin Goodspeed, this here is home. It can be hard to know where to start with this Goodspeed. Waking up on a sidewalk half drunk offers much to go on, but we can't be let off the hook so easily. At first glance, The Regular is a story about an alcoholic wordsmith who, having struck a vein with his off-kilter style, continues to ply its mysterious logic in executing his craft. But thanks to the keen observation of a local city beat journalist, the aperture widens and the book settles in as a larger metaphor for a region running thick with contradictions, a place that can seem incapable of reconciling the old and what has passed with the new and its inevitable future. Enter one Cyrus Cleburne, journalist for the city's alternative newspaper, The Weekly. Cleburne is a keen observer of this corner of the beacon of the New South, its facts and fictions in tandem and in conflict. It is a promising combustible fuel, and in one Marvin Goodspeed, it may well have tapped a gusher. For this Goodspeed is a man on a mission, or is it an anti-mission? Having embraced the thundering contradictions, he defends them as he rails against them.
Mission, more like anti-mission, am I right, boy?
Yes, you're right. Having embraced the thundering contradictions, he defends them as he rails against them. And we will come to suspect that he knows this all well enough, not just triangulating the coordinates where the survey line of real V-myth falls, but purposefully leaping back and forth across that boundary as if a porous wormwood fence put up only for show. Here's where Cyrus Cleburne will zero in, that DMZ separating who we are from who we think we are. This book plies the thoroughfares of alcoholism, writing, being a Southerner, and how all three fill the mash bill of this one man's unique spin on victory. It is a documentary, but one that peddles in fact and fiction as it digs the deeper strata of truth. It does not aim to settle anything, only to shine hot light on the dichotomy that most people hold within them and often hold on to for dear life, if only out of a fear of the new. For The Regular sits at a crossroads in the evolution of the modern South. The mid-late 90s. The old is finally losing hold of the narrative, the new just about poised to assert itself, to break away from the old. But it is not there, not yet. There is a reckoning in the works, one whose particulars we still find ourselves fighting over all these years later, against modernity, against change. This place could not then, and in many ways still cannot, bring itself to commit fully. And though a new and sudden fame had found Goodspeed, it had changed nothing insofar as his duty was concerned. There was still the maintenance of the routine to consider. Enter the Asa Inman Blue Ribbon Buffet. In here, one could accept Sputnik or Tet as the day's headlines. For time, we will find is rendered irrelevant here.
Cheers, Dave. I think it's somebody else's turn now, actually.
Relegated to just another amongst the calcified patrons drowning a thirst or a doldrum. Goodspeed raises a fingered V, as in victory, gains the barkeep Howard's attention. Howard nods, fixes a sequel to the empty glass. It is a popular tactic. The few others at the bar, Ez, Boo, Judy, Sang, Chuck, employ similar strategies. It is their time to waste. It is freedom. It is noon. It is a victory of sorts, these regulars giving time to slip, if only for an afternoon or an evening. But to the keen eye, one can also cite a spirited defense at work. It may often seem like little more than the pensive pursuit of silent drinking, but therein lay the commitment to that most noble goal. Snapping into bold italics what lay beyond question, the maintenance of things as they are. Within the confines of the Asa Inman, we see this whole regional experiment play out, for better, for worse. At its core, the regular is about more than a man. It is about the man for sure, but it is also this story of the old and the new, and their seeming inability to live peaceably with one another. How the old can seem incapable of handing things off to what is next, and how this push and pull has a distorting effect, the old forcing itself on the new over and over, generation after generation, creating a distortion so wide and normal seeming that everything falls into it. Confused and jumbled, the truths have to claw their way out. Sometimes they fail to do so. Sometimes they do, but only as a mashup of what is real and what is myth. And as abstract as that all might sound, it pegs Marvin Goodspeed, and the environment in which he lives pegs them to a T. For this is a man and a place having taken in the myths so deeply that they are convinced myth may be the only truth one really needs. In the mind of the South, W.J. Cash wrote, "The poor farmer, the thing that sent him swinging up the slope at Gettysburg, was before all else nothing more or less than his conviction. The conviction that nothing living could cross him and get away with it." Now, if this here isn't Goodspeed's guiding decree, we'll find ourselves hard-pressed to define what is. Obsessed with ignoring the expectations of a societal order that piques his nature, crosses him at every turn, this regular marches on, defiant, irreverent, a one-man picket's charge giving sure oblivion the finger. Cyrus Cleburne, our good journalist, will come to see all of this through clear eyes. He will come to recognize this Goodspeed character as a stand-in for the South circa 1990s. A place already pluralistic, accepting, multiracial, whether it cares to admit it or not. All of the progress and all of the retrograde, the lurching forward and back, the baked-in environmental thoughts, sayings, instincts, all of the good, all of the bad, all the contradictions held in the same regional headspace. It is a place that wants to improve, and it is a place that has no interest in improving. It is a place where the contradictions themselves have become instinctual. Enter the power of myth. The hold that myth can have is like religion. To lose myth is to lose religion, a loss of identity. Some minds cannot bend without breaking, and so they drift into an often extreme alternate reality instead. In this frame, the cloud of alcoholism can come to resemble a tool. Inside that cloud, reality can be sculpted as one wants. Here is a region so haunted by its past, so much of it sloshing around in the everywhere day to day of the place, that it is hard even for those actively trying to fully escape. And so, the clouding, alternate real effects of alcohol settle in as Goodspeed's chosen vehicle for upholding myths in the face of devastating truths. Shovel in the white-hot coal of character and environment, compress the bellows of facts meets fiction. Nature will have its way. Make no mistake, it will have its vulgar way with you. So knowing that, why not revel in it? Why not roll about in the filthy business, thrash about in it madly, live the truth, live the myth as if it were truth, love with vigor, hate with vigor, drink with a vigor some might confuse for virtue. William B. Huey wrote a work of fiction titled Mud on the Stars. In it, the incorrigible old Miss Ella counseled, get you some things to love and some things to hate, and then love them and hate them with all your soul. A lodestar decree that pegs the very nature of one Marvin Goodspeed to a T. Thank you. And now I would like to, very happy to introduce my friend, JD John from St. Augustine, Florida.
And
How's
other
things in
places.
sunny Florida, Gerald?
Yeah, yeah. A couple of quick questions for you, Dave, if you have a moment, as I'm sure you do. You were talking about alcoholism and at the end of your presentation there. And I wondered when you were writing if you ever worried about about minimizing the devastating effects of alcoholism, as you used it as a sort of vehicle to explore this topic.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure I really spent any more time grappling with any other one thing in this. And you know, so that's why I went to great lengths to not minimize, but to maximize the physical toll and the physical destruction that alcoholism takes. You know, it's also like trying to find the right word. It's in service also to a larger metaphor, and I you know make that clear. An individual alcohol addiction, that's tragic enough, but an addiction to historical myth, you scale that up to a societal, cultural level, you spread that across multiple generations, and it's just as tragic. The effects are just as tragic and even more devastating. And so, you know, that's how I dealt with it. There's nothing in the addiction, be it alcohol, be it the past, be it the myth of the past, that is in any way glamorous or romantic. We don't want to be this guy.
Yeah, yeah. And good. I don't think we are.
Right.
Yeah.
I met a lot of people like him, and you know, honestly, his character is you know, a mashup of a lot of people that I met in my 20s, back in my harder drinking 20s. And it was tragic at the same time. It was really amazing to see the kind of individuals that took on this addiction. Like they just couldn't shake it. Some really seemed like they didn't want to shake it. Like there was something inside of that was comforting, and the world outside of it, they, you know, which I think is a fairly accurate representation of the problem of alcoholism. It allows for that alternate reality, that world in which you do not have to face the truths that may be too painful to face. But in the same breath, honestly, I met people that just seemed to like it better. And I found that odd, you know, just to careen off into oblivion like that, not happily, but almost absent-mindedly and differently. So there's some of that in here too.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a more broad-based question, I think, but were there any particular works or writers that you would like to give a tip of your hat to as your book's
Yeah.
about to come out?
Well,
I mean,
it's
I'm sure there are some.
yeah, there's actually too many to, I mean, I've actually even probably forgotten a lot of them. I got really deep into Southern literature and Southern history in general about 20, 25 years ago. And a lot of that percolated up and, eventually, was the wellspring for, the backgrounds, the references, the regional references, the deep historical tacks that I take in the book. There's just a ton of it. People I'd never heard of, and I don't think most anyone has heard of anymore. People that were flash in the pans in their time, might have been famous at one point, but had just kind of been forgotten. There's obviously the Walker Percys, the Shelby Foots, the Flannery O'Connors, the ones that we all know about. But for every one of them, there's 10 that you haven't. And I just found equally fascinating. Clarence Cason was one. William B. Huey, who I reference. But to more pointedly answer your question, I'll settle on one in particular, which was W.J. Cash, The Mind of the South, which I reference also.
Okay.
That book it was fascinating to me. I'm still to this day, I'm not sure I've ever read anything quite like it. It was published in 1941, I believe, and it was published as a history. But I was reading it in the late 90s. And to me, it struck me as like, well, this is history, but it's also creative nonfiction. But he was, and so I feel like he was doing that, but long before creative nonfiction was even a thing. And so in that way, the book itself feels very much ahead of its time. And even more directly, it's ahead of its time in that he was, in the book, he presents, very detailed kind of outlay of Southern history. But alongside it, he documents the mythic history as well, the myths of the South, and very convincingly throughout the book braids the two until you realize that you really can't fully understand one without the other. And that was the point he was trying to make.
I see.
And no historians and very few writers even at that time were doing this. I mean, nowadays it seems kind of fairly run of the mill, but it was a very courageous move on his part, because the white South was not interested in that kind of a reckoning back then, for sure. And so it was courageous. At the same time, it was just super creative. Mind of the South. It's an entertaining read if anyone here has any interest at all in a creative take on history, if a little bit dated, and it is a little bit dated these days. It still is. It's a book you can read as nonfiction, creative nonfiction, or history. The Mind of the South. So but I won't bore you all with any more, because I could go on and on about influences and things that supported my effort.
Right.
Instead,
and sometime we probably should have the conversation about what's happening around Atlanta and Georgia right now in terms of politics. That might be another meeting, I think.
Yeah. It seems like we always get into the news, and not necessarily for the best of reasons.
Not for the best. It's all those myths that you guys are struggling.
It is. It's I wasn't kidding. It is. It's with every footfall in this place, and
the echoes.
It is. It's a place that is. Actually, we'll read this. I wrote this down the other day. I thought it's a really it really encapsulates how I feel about living here. I'm originally from New England, but I've lived most of my adult life in Atlanta. And you know, my friends are a mix of people that grew up here, multi-generational, and transplants from all over the country. But I wrote this the other day. I thought it was kind of hit the nail on the head. As a transplant, I can clearly see that this is a place constantly on the royal, yet is as warm and giving a place as you'll find. It is odd, appalling, and wonderful all at once, and I can hardly picture living anywhere else anymore. So
Yeah,
it's kind of gets its hooks in you.
yeah,
in
it
an odd
does.
way.
It does. Okay.
Yeah, right,
Well,
Jerry.
maybe we should-
You're my fellow Southerner now.
Right. Not by birth.
So with that, I'm gonna stop my yammering and introduce my good friend, JD John. JD turned to writing fiction after careers in teaching and communication for colleges and universities. First published his book of short stories, A Crone's Tale, Atmosphere Press. And it harkens back to his days as student and teacher of Shakespeare and the British Renaissance. He's nearly completed, I should say, a second connected collection of these fables for our times that again repurpose the conventions of classical fairy and folk tales. Jerry lives in Florida, as mentioned, with his wife, who's also a writer and student of literature. With that, Mr. J.D. John.
Thank you, Dave. And hello, everyone. It's good to be back in the Southwest, if only virtually. I ended my professional career, or my paying career, I guess, at Arizona State. So I have a kind of fondness for the desert and for that environment. As Dave mentioned, the Crone's Tales, Fables for New Times, is a collection of short stories that mimic traditional formats, the fairy tales, the folk tales, and the ballads that we're familiar with, probably most of us from our childhoods. I think that readers will generally recognize some of the characteristics of these tales. They're rather abstract in conventional settings, in palaces, gloomy forests, and sleepy villages. You'll probably also be somewhat familiar with their one-dimensional characters who don't seem to have much of an inner life going on. They're mostly reactive to a single problem or a challenge. And most of these tales finish up with some sort of dramatic or astounding resolution. Now, I'd like to read one of my versions of fairy tale for you today. It features a couple of my favorite characters, a couple of hapless brigands who are spend a lot of time bickering and are mostly layabouts and unsuccessful at what they do. And you'll also be introduced to the old woman who's the title character. Now, this particular story happens to occur about midway through the 30 tales, and it begins to point ahead to a kind of emerging story that goes through this collection, which is the crone's plans for her own future. So you might be listening for that. And I also should warn you, just out of fairness, that these stories are written in the crone's narrative voice, which is early modern English, I should say, which is sort of the language of Shakespeare or the King James Bible. So you might take a little while to get your ear attuned to the language, but I don't think it's going to stand in the way. And by the way, writing in this voice was both fun and liberating for me, because I was struggling as a writer in modern vernacular. And it was also a big challenge when it came to editing the book for Atmosphere Press. So without further ado, I'd like to read The Highwayman and the Jolly Crone, tale number 15. Dejected sat the two highwaymen, Dinkin and Leslie, beside the crooked track that ran through the deep, dark forest. For they had labored both night and day and had taken nothing. "'Tis far more difficult than e'er I imagined," moaned Leslie, wiping his sunburnt brow. "'Tis because thou knowest not what thou be about, thou blockhead," uttered Dinkin with ruddy cheek and blazing eye. First must thou shout, stand, in a voice of thunder, and only then saith, deliver, thou empty reed. Thou hast all the brains of an ant, I ween. Nay, cousin, deliver be the main point of it all. What care we if they cast their pearls afore us and flee, or if they bring forth their treasure with trembling hands and rooted foot? Sans they deliver, what hast we gained, reasoned Leslie. Ah, woe is us. How could things go more amiss? Thou couldst be seated in poison oak, as I see thou art, observed Dinkin with a weary sigh. That very morning, the twain had crouched amidst the thorns and brambles that grow thick beside the bending path, when there came a gilded carriage with the gilded lords sitting therein, feasting on candied figs. Of gold were the chains he wore, crusted with jewels were the rings upon his sticky fingers. His sapphire cloak was of the finest satin, and bright buckles of polished silver adorned his silk slippers. Deliver, shouted Leslie, leaping from behind a mulberry bush. Nay, shouted Dinkin, stand first, then deliver. Drive on, driver, bid the gilded lord in a loud, bored voice. These varlets be but paltry poltroons that know not what they be about. Thereupon the haughty coachman did click his tongue and shout, hi! The brace of silver-white chargers pricked up their ears, and away the carriage did fly, but not before it bowled over the highwaymen like two badly marred duck pins. Battered were Dinkin and Leslie, and in sooth, more bruised than battered were their spirits. Mayhap we should return us to our village and resume our labors there, lamented Leslie. Oh, ye of little hope, sneered Dinkin. Loath am I to lug a hod about, or e'er again sweep streets with a broom of vile straw. 'Tis but a matter of time before we fall upon riches untold. For Dinkin was mindful still of the lovely lady who'd come a-riding all lost and lone, not 2 days before. Stand, had he shouted in a voice like thunder. And deliver, had Leslie added, leaping like a gen from amidst the briars that twine within the shadowy wood. Pray, my good fellows, harm me not, for I be but a maid all innocent, bereft in this world, and on a desperate errand of love. Reck we not, Dinkin had replied, for have we not great hunger ourselves and great need of those pearls thou hast about thy alabaster neck, and that jewel encrusted tiara that nestles there amidst those amber tresses of thine? Aye, and forget not those rings of silver and of gold that adorn thy delicate ivory fingers and most slender toes, had Leslie put in, somewhat shyly. Kind sirs, had the maiden then replied, all that and more wouldst I give thee, but had ye but a bag or a carryall in which to bear it off. Dumbstruck, the hapless highwaymen had then looked at one another and then down at their empty hands. And now, no longer may I tarry here in this dank place, for I must away to court and there lay claim to my dear lord, whom I have loved since I were but a lass. Yet has he not abandoned me to shame and sorrow, and I all great with his child? At which words a crystalline tear had coursed down her cream white cheek. Then had Dinkin stepped aside, saying, do pass by unharmed, fair maid, and Godspeed to thee. For though we be but thieves and ruffians, we be not villains. Low had he bowed before her, pulling the gate-mawed Leslie from the maiden's path. Off had she pranced then upon her gray gelding, gaily singing, tra-la, 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 as lightly on she rode. E'en now could Dinkin hear her silver laugh echo through the wood, while the feckless thieves had stood empty of hand athwart the twisty, narrow path. Alas, moaned Leslie, interrupting Dinkin's morose reverie, 'tis starting to rain. What a misery of brigands we art. Do hush thy whining, replied Dinkin. Do I not hear someone a-coming? 'Twas true. From out the forest gloom there came a bullfrog's voice, singing a weird chanty of wind and storm and moon and stars. In a trice there appeared a stooped figure, leaning on a stick of yew wood and wrapped from toe to head in robes and scarves the hue of coal, whilst toting an old canvas sack upon her shoulder. Deliver, shouted Leslie, violently scratching at his itching arms and backside. Nay, stand first and then deliver, corrected Dinkin, his voice also like thunder. Up looked the face of the traveler, and 'twas that of an aged crone, wrinkled and blear of eye, yet with a small smile upon her crinkled lips. Gladly wouldst I deliver, save possessions have I none, said this beldame. Then what be in that sack thou dost carry? Demanded Leslie. Why, 'tis empty as e'er be the dreams of an old woman, replied the hag. Hand it over and will not harm thee, said Dinkin, for we are in need of somewhat in which to carry off our pelf. From what I hear, muttered she, ye have little enow of that. This empty sack is all ye need, though ye knowest it not. Yet hand it over she did, adding aloud, 'tis a lesson all must learn. Take only what is needful and beware of a hungering for more. Then off stalked the old woman back into the dim forest from which she came. What a strange old hag was she, said Leslie, scratching at his spotty arms and leg. Anon, there came along the twisted way a merchant from the town. Plump was he as a Saint's Day goose, and bags of gold hung from his belt like ripe pears from a bough. With the fierceness of lions did the two highwaymen spring forth, demanding that the merchant stand and deliver there and then. Watched they with eager eyes as his trembling hands dropped bag after bag of coin and jewels and chains of rare metal into the old crone's sack. Then flew they like the wind unto a secret lea, wherein Leslie fell upon the ground, scratching himself and laughing aloud. Peering into the old woman's sack to tally up what all they had taken, Dinkin did exclaim, why, 'tis empty. What hath become of our hard-earned pelf? Mayhap the old woman's bag hath a hole in it, ventured Leslie. Thinkest thou so? Exclaimed Dinkin. Thou wickless candle, thou heap of sodden kindling. Yet seek as he might, nor hole nor rent in that old sack could he find. Hello, what have we here? Saith Dinkin then, as out from that hag's bag's recesses he pulled a roast of beef and a pot of mustard. Ah well, ne'er look a gift goat in the eye till thou taste the stew, as they say. Do they now? Puzzled Leslie. The two highwaymen then fell upon their repast without further word, as vultures fall upon fresh carrion. From that day forth did the careers of Leslie and Dinkin as brigands and thieves take wing. They robbed princes and princesses, burghers and clowns, abbots and freeholders, one and all. Yet from their pilferer's sack poured not diamonds, nor pearls, gold, nor silver, ducats, nor guilders, but banquets of venison and ham and beef and ale and sweet fruit and desserts of honey and milk instead. Fat grew the twain, and more sanguine Dinkin's temper became as well, till the two became known both wide and far as the jolly highwaymen, ever courteous and gentle as they preyed upon unwary travelers. And all the while, deeper in the forest, the sly old dame did smile and hum her wild sea chanties, as both day and night the jolly highwayman's pelf appeared heaped upon her doorstep, whence 'twas quickly whisked into her burgeoning storerooms with great and tender care. That was The Jolly Highwayman and the Crone. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed writing it. I understand that, Mo, you have a couple of questions you'd like to ask me.
I do. I'm just getting back alive now. I'd like to
Mo,
say,
welcome back to the land of the living.
thank you. I enjoyed that. It's amazing how much sly humor you have in your tales. And
Well, thank you.
I'll add two brief questions and we'll turn it back over to Jerry.
Good.
It's an odd choice for you to write adult fairy tales. What attracted you to doing that in these particular times?
Yeah, indeed. Well, actually, when I retired, I thought I'd start by writing detective fiction. And I very quickly came up against a writer's block. When you write detective fiction, you actually have to understand what the crime is and why it's obscure and difficult to fathom out. So I decided that it was important that I just keep writing whatever came to mind, and I happened upon a fairy tale, which I wrote, and then another one popped into my head, and so on and so forth. And I realized that I was having a good deal of fun playing around with the fairy tale conventions, like the happily ever after idea, or the notion of the evil ogre or witch who's always the antagonist. And I also began to realize that it was a nice vehicle, because of its concision and its focus, to take a single idea or an issue and treat that in the context of the fairy tale setting, so that some of the stories are about the perils of parenting. For example, one of them features a Ponzi schemer working his wiles. There's a story about a doctor who tries to make some medical advances without much success, I might add. And a few of the stories are about marriage and what happens in marriage. So there were some things that created some interesting opportunities for creative fun. And I really did discover a good deal of enjoyment in unpacking and repackaging the fairy tale genre. Now, I'm not the first one, of course, to do this. We can go back to Anne Sexton's collection of poems and transformations. I think there's a television show called The Black Mirror on TV that uses some fairy tales and magical, fabulous stories as well. So, and there's a whole school of contemporary fairy tale writers and reworkers. But to answer your question, Maureen, it was mainly, I just sort of hit upon it by accident and found that I enjoyed doing it.
How dare you have fun with your writing?
I know. So wrong of me.
Well, at least your reader has fun, because once you get used to that style, which is unusual, they are quite enjoyable. And the other question is that your collection has both a preface of sorts from the old woman, or to the old woman, and
Yes.
then there's an apologia at the end by the old woman herself. Do you have more to say about that?
Yeah, those two things, which kind of bookend the stories themselves, came about as the collection began to evolve and take shape. About 10 or 12 of the, after I'd written about 10 or 12 of the stories, I realized that my readers might begin to wonder where these stories came from, how they arrived in the 21st century, why they were written in the voice they're written in. So that's when the idea of having the crone appear in New York City on the subway came to me. And I also realized that the crone and the teller of the tales were probably the same person. So again, I wanted to point the reader's attention a little bit to that idea as they got into the story. So the preface was to the old woman on the subway is basically sets up some expectations for what happens kind of behind the scenes as the stories are unfolded. And I think it also ultimately, and this I think is more of an accident than an intention on my part, they kind of position the stories as recovered artifacts, rather like the folk and fairy tales that the Brothers Grimm and other ethnographers discovered. Now, the apologia, that came about when I was working with the press itself and one of the editors who found the last story in the collection, The Crone's Farewell. He felt that kind of left things too much hanging, too much incomplete. And I had originally thought I'd do that just because I already knew that I had other stories coming and I wanted to do a second collection, and I wanted people to be hankering for more, if you will. So at the same time, I wanted something to put a kind of period on the end of this first collection of stories. And so I had the old crone have a sort of final say once she's in our present time, talking about what she's doing here and a little bit about why she's doing it. So that's why it has both.
Okay, that seemed appropriate at the end, and just to get old-fashioned again.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
This is,
that's the
this
cover.
is this book, The Crone's Tale. Do I have it upside down? No, I don't.
No, it's beautiful. Yes. Oh, thank you so much.
And we've taken a lot of time, so we'll turn this back over to Jerry.
Thank you so much, Mo, Aaron, Dave, and Gerald. This has been absolutely amazing. What a great way to spend the afternoon. Now, before I hand it over for questions, I'd like to hear from Cameron Finch, who is with Atmosphere, and she can talk to us about the publication process. So, Cameron / Cami, take it away.
Hi, hello everybody. Thanks everyone for just being here. I still feel so giddy, I think, just knowing that there's another human hearing me from where I am. And it's so wonderful to all be here for the sake of stories, I think. Thank you to all of the readers. This is the first time that I had heard all 4 of the authors read, so this was truly a treat. Thank you for all being here, and thank you for Jerry and JP and the Southwest Manuscripters for hosting. Thank you so much. If you want to, I wanted to say, if you want to see this crew again next week, there is a sequel / reprise of the same 4 authors, Aaron, Mo, Jerry, and Dave, all reading, and it will be hosted by Atmosphere Press, and that is at 1 p.m. Pacific time, and you can find out more information from Atmosphere's social media, @Atmosphere Press, and you can find out the details there. They may read from some other part of the book, so you won't want to miss it. I'm Cameron Finch. I'm the associate editor at Atmosphere Press, and I've had the pleasure of working with all 4 of the authors you heard from tonight for the past few months. I guess I'd like to just remind you that all of their books can be found on Atmosphere Press's website. That's atmospherepress.com/books. I can drop that in the chat if that's helpful. And also, books can be found anywhere books can be found. Your local independent bookstore, Barnes & Noble, and that little known universe called Amazon. And unlike traditional publishers, which typically take a large cut or royalties, Atmosphere does not. We take 0 royalties from the profit or from the sales of books. So please know that you would be directly supporting all of the authors tonight. A little bit about Atmosphere Press. We are officially based in Austin, Texas, but as you know, I'm in New York City. Lenny, who you see here tonight, is in Vermont. We have book designers who are based in Brazil and Portugal, and really we're a global community. You heard from fiction writers tonight, but we publish works of all genres, anything you can imagine, children's books, poetry, self-help guides, memoirs, and genres that maybe you're not quite sure what they are. We are currently open for manuscript reading, and you can find out more information about guidelines and how to submit on the Atmosphere Press website, atmospherepress.com. We'd love to hear from you and read your work, no matter what genre it is. We are what we call an author-friendly publisher, which means that we have we have kind of a partnership model, meaning that the author fronts up initial payment, and that pays towards the publication, as well as pays our excellent editorial and design staff. And in the other hand, then authors receive 100% of their rights. They get to maintain their rights and our artistic, their artistic autonomy. I don't know what else to say. I guess if you have any other questions, feel free to look at the FAQ section on atmospherepress.com. And if it's okay with you, Jerry, I can just drop in my email address in the chat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This has been, oh, Cammie, this has been great. I tell you, what a great forum we had here today. Thank you to you, Atmosphere, to the 4 authors, and hopefully you're on our database, and we'll invite you for further Zoom meetings if you're ever in town we meet in Palos Verdes, California, Southern California. Love to see you in person once we get back to the real world when that happens. So
that would be amazing.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to any of our attendees and see if you guys have any questions. Go at it. You can unmute. Anyone want? I think a lot of them have been contributing within the chat also. But
well, I was going to bribe Mo to read the sexy part of her novel that she alluded to earlier.
I think we may have to devote a whole.
Yeah, it can be our sequel.
And you wouldn't have to pay me much at all.
Oh, thank you.
Maybe next time I'll tell about the girls getting on the ship and I'll read the sexy passage.
There you go.
If Cameron will consent to that.
I have a wife who speaks French, so I'm very lucky.
That would be helpful.
You say something in French, honey? Oui, oui. Okay. All right.
Comment allez-vous?
Oh, go ahead.
Comment allez-vous?
Pardonnez-moi.
Un petit peu.
How are
Petit
you?
peu.
Comment allez-vous? Bien.
Thank you, everyone.
Merci beaucoup.
So does anyone have any questions? If not, we may start the recording, but wanted to see if we wanted any more information before we do.
Good.
No.
Someone seemed to have a question for me in the chat. I saw about wouldn't writing in the third person.
Yeah, it was me.
Oh, and then I saw Faith, and since the book with religious, a religious book, I got confused there. But I don't want to paraphrase you incorrectly. It's something along the lines of, wouldn't writing in the third person. You take it away, Faith.
Well, I'm writing a story about my late husband, so it is third person, and there's a tremendous amount of history, documented history in it. So I was wondering, do you call it nonfiction or fiction, or I don't know what happens when you do third person. It's all third person.
A third person, and yet
meaning I'm telling the story of somebody who passed away.
I see. Well, I suppose it's now. The best I could say is that it's what your intention is to be factual. And that sort of thing.
Yes.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, because I had a student who had me write his father's obituary 2 weeks ago, and something you don't get paid for anymore. I thought these journalism jobs are really drying up. So I in my case, going third person, it just absolved me of any commitments that might be implied in terms of being mistaken for a work of creative nonfiction or a memoir, because I started it out as a memoir, a work of nonfiction, but I wanted to do as much as I could then halfway through to make it, to run away from that. And so really I mean I may be trying to get it both ways. Just for me, it was one more way changing the names, and then, like I said, the second half. But for me, it was one more way of just ensuring this was not a memoir.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if there's no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. Again, thank you, authors. Thank you, Cami. Thank you, Atmosphere Press. Thank you, Zoom.
Thank you.
Indeed. Thanks so
everyone.
much to Jerry and
On
JP and everyone
Yeah,
for having us.
Thanks,
It's been
thanks
really
for
great.
having us. Thanks for
Appreciate it.
having
Stay
us.
healthy, everybody.
Yeah.
You as well, Faith.
Yeah,
Thank
On
you. That
behalf
was
of
so much fun.
Southwest Manuscripters and the Surfwriters Club, thank you. And
Ah.
we're cutting off now.
we're out.
All
Thanks
right.
for being here.
Take
Best
care.
wishes
Bye,
from
all.
Canada.